So yeah, I'm really grateful to be here. I'm just regretful that I can't actually be in California, add to my collection of Golden Bears t-shirts. This is joint work that I want to talk about with Seth Hill at UCSD and Greg Huber at Yale. And it's actually very, very auspicious timing because, as you'll see, this is very closely related to the presidential election, which, if you pay close attention to politics, you know we have a US election coming up in 21 days. And jokes don't work as well on Zoom, I realize. I'm actually going to next week be writing this research up for 538, Nate Silver's website that focuses on political prediction. And so we're just about to publicly post this paper for the first time. So it is really an optimal time to get your feedback and to see what you make of it. And one of the conversations when we were getting ready to go was about the value of interdisciplinary feedback. And I'm deeply excited, having had great conversations with the population studies and demography folks here at Penn. I'm just very, very excited to see how you react. So the title of this work is Not by Turnout Alone, Measuring the Sources of Electoral Change, 2012 to 2016. Okay, and this work starts with a kind of long-standing problem in political science, which is if you see two consecutive elections, and in the first election, one party wins, and in the next election, another party wins, what explains that change into an election to election outcomes? This is something that political scientists have been interested in for decades and is in some sense the fundamental question of democratic elections, right? What explains election to election change? And if the comment in the chat is maybe Herb saying like, actually the Campbell citation is 66, that's true. These questions are take on, and I think they're important in a number of ways. They're important because if electoral change is entirely driven by turnout, that's obviously going to have implications for the kinds of campaigns that people run. If I'm running a campaign that's focused on juicing turnout, I'm going to be much more focused on voter registration, on canvassing, on the kinds of campaign tactics that we know to mobilize voters. It's very hard, for instance, on somebody's doorstep to persuade them, but it's relatively easy on somebody's doorstep to mobilize them. And this also has profound implications for governance, insofar as politicians who believe that the way that they're going to win re-election is primarily by juicing turnout, by mobilizing and energizing their own supporters, are going to behave really differently than politicians who believe that the path to re-election lies more with persuading median voters and potentially adopting more moderate or popular policies. Okay. So there are two broad explanations when we're thinking about why one party may win one election and then a different party may win a second election. One of them is turnout, changes in actually the specific people who vote, and the second is persuasion. So you can imagine an election to election change that is driven entirely by turnout, where we literally don't have a single person, the same person who votes in this election and that election. If I were comparing, say, the election of 1860 to the election of, say, 1980, you know what? It's not going to be a persuasion story because there are not going to be that many voters who participated in both elections. But by the same token, at a time when a lot of people are very engaged in politics and when there are millions of consistent voters, elections could well be driven by the preferences of these two election voters. And indeed, in the wake of the 2016 election, there was a lot of discussion about this question in 2012 and 2016. What explained the somewhat unexpected victory of Donald Trump, especially in key states like my home state of Pennsylvania, or Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, other northern and Midwestern states. Okay. Now, if you think about turnout and persuasion, math favors persuasion. And what I mean by that is that if I told you you could either persuade one voter or turn out one voter, you would choose to persuade one voter, because if you persuade one voter, you not only add a vote to your own column, but you also take away a vote from your opponent's column, right? So we should ex ante kind of expect that persuasion is going to be the engine if these two factors are equal, but it may also be that, especially in an age when swing voters are declining, when a larger and larger share of the electorate is anchored to partisan loyalties, it may well be that these two things are not equal because we may have many more opportunities for turnout than for persuasion. Okay. So while the math may favor persuasion, the fact of polarization and the widely observed decline in floating voters may well favor turnout. Okay. We care about this a lot. As I started to mention, we care about this because it influences the ways in which parties choose to campaign, how they spend their dollars. In fact, right now in 2020, we have a very interesting kind of natural or unnatural experiment going on in that the COVID-19 virus has changed the level of door-to-door contact, and particularly there's also cross-party variation, right? The Trump campaign is more comfortable with sending out canvassers than the Biden campaign. But more generally, whether you think that an election is going to be a turnout election or a persuasion election is going to influence the kinds of strategies that you adopt. Trump had said in 2019 that, when he was asked, are you going to be appealing to swing voters? He said that I think my base is so strong, I'm not sure that I have to do that. And I think that a fair number of potentially unexpected elements of the Trump presidency can kind of be condensed into that one sentence. The idea that President Trump genuinely believes that his base can carry him to victory. And so this is a president running for re-election who has never cracked, say, 50% approval, and who has not seemed to really prioritize winning over swing voters. That said, on the flip side, Joe Biden, I think, is in some ways well understood as a bet by many Democrats that a candidate like a somewhat more centrist candidate, potentially a white male candidate, would have more crossover appeal. And so we can see that the two parties in some key ways are making different bets about the relative influence of turnout and persuasion. Okay. And not only that, this in a critical way influences governing strategies. Barack Obama had said, repeated the adage that a lot of governing happens between the 40 and the 60-yard lines, or the 40 on one side and the 40 on the other. And that, a lot of governance happens in the center. Very commonly, people after winning their primary are thought to move to the center, right? An aide to Mitt Romney famously said that the general election would be like an Etch-a-Sketch, right? That Romney would, in essence, get to start over in terms of branding himself with general election voters. So the extent to which, and if you think about, say, like the UK election in 1997, where the Conservatives, who had governed for decades with Margaret Thatcher and then with John Major, get wiped out by Tony Blair in 1997, right? And it's a very common observation that after parties lose, they often attribute, they have this kind of debate amongst themselves, was this loss driven by persuasion or by turnout? And the Tories in 1997 decided it was driven by turnout, which was not actually borne out by the facts, but deciding that you have failed to excite your base is in some sense an easier strategy for a party, because it means that you can basically keep your existing appeal, keep your existing coalition, and indeed just kind of play up that base, right? Okay, so how do we actually address this question? You might think as a demographer, well, it sounds like a pretty fundamental question. So I'm kind of surprised that political science, that you can give a talk in 2020, which doesn't just tell us, okay, here's what we know, or here's what the answer is. But there are actually some challenges to figuring this out, not the least of which is the fact that the balance between turnout and persuasion is going to shift both across elections for a variety of reasons, including many that would warm demographers' hearts, but also the balance could shift across places, right? It may well shift across groups of voters, and so in the U.S. Federation, we may well see that turnout is the key story in certain places, but persuasion may be in others. Okay. Methodologically, this problem is made harder by the fact of the secret ballot. So the secret, or the Australian ballot in the US, means that we don't know individual vote choice, right? Except if we survey people. And we, of course, can survey people. One of the downsides with surveying them, though, is that we don't get an even representation across the spectrum of political interest. In particular, when we do surveys, like I've been doing a series of surveys here in Pennsylvania, and when I match my survey respondents to voter file data, I find that the people that I've recruited to take surveys voted in 2018 at rates in excess of 90%, right? Which is turnout way higher than what turnout should be if I were getting a reasonable slice of the population. And I actually have tried to approach this research question with panel data. The problem is there too, panel data, so many of my respondents are repeated voters that they're consistent voters, that you would estimate almost all of the election to election shift to be driven by changes in preferences, when in fact that may not be correct. Okay. So the secret ballot.
Can I just interrupt you like you wanted to be interrupted? Is that because they know it's a political survey, or because people who answer surveys in general are that way?
I think more the second, but both, right? Almost all of the, and Herb could certainly speak to this in a powerful way as well, but almost all of the surveys that political scientists do tend to be political surveys, right? So we ask people a whole battery of political questions. And as a consequence of that, yes, we tend to find that as survey response rates have declined, as late as 1980, you could get most of the people that you called on the phone on a random night to actually take a survey. Whereas now, just as an example, I recently took the voter file in Pennsylvania, identified 10,000 medium interest voters, so people who voted in one election of the past 4, but not more than that. And I then bought their email addresses and their phone numbers. I posted advertisements on Facebook targeting these specific individuals. And for my original sample of 10,000, more than 1,200 Facebook was able to figure out who they were, what their Facebook account was, and show them at least one ad. The average person saw 10 ads, and I got 6 responses, right? So that is just insane. Even if we forget the first stage, that's still below 1% as a response rate goes, right? And so there are just tremendous, and we learned this with surveys of the presidential election in 2016. When your response rates are that low, there are just tremendous opportunities for small biases to propagate, right? For small biases to mean large differences in what your inference is. Josh, does that answer your question?
Absolutely, thank you.
Cool. But I do think, if I had substantially more resources, I would do more political polling disguised as other kinds of polling, because for instance, when I've analyzed the University of Michigan survey of consumer attitudes, you find that people's economic attitudes are less political, because most of the survey is, hey, how are you getting on economically? And it's not full of political cues. And so, ideally, I would love to do more survey research in which I just throw a few political questions onto a survey that seems to be largely apolitical. Okay, so prior approaches. One which I've used is panel data, the fact that we can observe the same people at multiple points over time. But that, as I mentioned, has the downside that the kinds of people who participate in panels are your kind of high turnout voters. And so you're selecting on this key quantity. So survey response is correlated with political engagement, and that may overstate persuasion. There are also a whole bunch of model-based approaches, often which work from an ecological inference kind of framework. And we've tried this too. And indeed, my co-author Seth Hill has a Bayesian EI model, ecological inference model, in which you try to impute the sort of interior cells from knowing the broad crosstabs, knowing what fraction of the electorate in a given place was a 2-election voter, or a only 2012 or only 2016. The challenge is just that those models are very, very sensitive to the assumptions that you make. And so we have burned through, I'm sure, many, many millions of CPUs trying to get those models to converge to something that was stable and credible. And I'm not going to talk about them here because we were not successful. So our approach is very data-oriented and very measurement-oriented, right? Rather than relying heavily on surveys, we're going to take a different approach, which is going to rely almost entirely on administrative data. Specifically what we're going to do. So every state in the United States after the Help America Vote Act is required to have a voter file, a single file in which they record all of the registered voters and whether they, whether they cast a ballot, and indeed how they cast a ballot. So we're going to take voter files from a number of states, and we're going to acquire those voter files both after 2012 and after 2016. And then what we're going to do is we're going to merge those voter files to each other and to precinct level election returns. And what that's going to let us do, so the US has a secret ballot, obviously, so we can know which individuals voted, and then we can know at the precinct level what number of votes went to each candidate in each election. And we can, to marry those two data sources, and what we wind up with then is data that's novel outside the commercial world. And so novel in the academy, novel for public release, which is going to tell us in a given precinct, and these precincts vary in size by state. So for instance, here in Pennsylvania, there are about 8,500 precincts or so. You'll see in Herb's, Ohio, I think there are maybe somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 precincts. They vary in size a bit, but they're often pretty small, granular units, and they're often demographically pretty homogeneous, which is going to give us additional statistical power on some of our questions. Okay. So this is probably a good place to stop for a moment and just see if you folks have developed questions to date. I realize that talks in different fields often make a host of assumptions that you may want to interrogate.
So we had a question from Will. Do you want to say your question, Will?
Sure. Thank you. You've been referring to turnout, and as I often hear people talking about turnout, it's all about energizing the base. But we also have to worry about turning out the swing voter, those centrists who are just getting disillusioned and not bothering to vote. So I'm just curious how important turnout of the swing voter is in what you're talking about.
So that's a good question. And it partly reflects a sort of gap between how campaigns think about this and how we as social scientists or analysts might think about this. So campaigns often put voters into a sort of a matrix, a 2x2 matrix, or a grid, can be more than 2x2, but essentially arraying people on two dimensions. How likely are they to vote? How likely are they to vote for your candidate? And then traditionally, the two groups of individuals that got the most attention were either people who weren't very likely to vote, but if they did, were very likely to vote for your candidate. So that might be certain, say in the Democratic Party's case, that might be certain constituencies of color. And then the other group of targets would be individuals who have a high likelihood of voting, but don't seem to have a strong likelihood of voting for either side, right? And one of the challenges is that the vast majority of voter mobilization work is done by people with a vested interest. And so it's going to target those groups of people. And there's also the interesting fact that who are the people that parties aren't sure how they're going to vote? Typically, but they think that they're very likely to vote. Typically, they're just people on whom there's not a lot of data, because as you get more data on people, the data is almost always separating. The data almost always predicts, oh, this profile leans in this direction, this profile leans in that direction. So I am broadly interested just in my broad question is, if you see that Obama wins Pennsylvania in 2012 and Trump wins Pennsylvania in 2016, and we want to explain how much of this is overall turnout across the spectrum, how much, that could be a decline in turnout among pro-Obama people who voted in 2012 but then stay home in 2016, could be demographically, right? It could be differential death, it could be differential aging into voting. So I'm going to lump all of those things under turnout, and that may be kind of, for some campaign applications, unhelpfully broad, but I think what it is going to be useful in doing is indicating, like so much of the Democratic primary in 2019 and 2020 was about this question. Essentially, did the Democrats lose in 2016 more because of turnout or more because of persuasion? And thus, should they think about a Bernie Sanders or a Joe Biden as kind of the answer to their electoral challenge? So that doesn't, I don't think I actually answered your question, except to say that there is a group of people who are, if you have a pretty middling score, it's not super clear that you're going to lean to the Republicans, not super clear that you're going to lean to the Democrats. You might not get that much direct mobilization, right? We may in that case have to hope that seeing your neighbor's signs or other forms of less direct mobilization help.
Great, Dan. Well, let's take it to the data collection, processing, and the results.
Cool. So we wanted to identify states, and in this case, because voter files are specific to states and because voter files are large files that are formatted differently and take a decent amount of work. I mean, the state of Ohio was like, that August, I spent a month working with the state of Ohio. And so we wanted states which are jointly demographically diverse, which were competitive in at least one of 2012 or 2016, have affordable voter files for both years. So there are some states like Arizona, Iowa, and Wisconsin where you can buy the voter file, but in Arizona, it's like tens of thousands of dollars, or at least it was when we were embarking on this. And where we could get the voter files for these 2 different years. Where possible, we want states that are going to record partisan affiliation. So some states have closed primaries and ask voters to register in that party, right? So the state that I call home, Pennsylvania, you have to register as a Democrat or a Republican if you want to participate in those primaries, right? My understanding is California used to, but is no longer like that. So when in doubt, those states are helpful because we not only can know what fraction of people turn out, what fraction of these voters are new voters, but also we can know what fraction of these people register as Democrats, okay? We also want states that are going to consistently record the voting outcomes at low levels of aggregation. So for instance, North Carolina allows people to vote early, and it doesn't, if you vote early, it doesn't group your vote with your specific precinct. It instead aggregates your vote as part of your county's early vote, right? And that's in part to protect, if you have an area with a low number of early votes, if you distinguish them, I might actually know how somebody voted. In some of this work, I've sometimes stumbled across precincts where you can identify, okay, here was a place where nobody voted for that candidate, so I kind of know how people voted. So that leaves us with the following list. And you're going to recognize a lot of these states because they are among the crucial states that have defined electoral competition in the last couple of years, right? Florida, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Okay, and I want extra points as an Easterner who knows how to say Nevada. So I think key things to point out, I have 3 states highlighted in red. These are the states that don't, on the voter file, identify party of registration. So there we're going to have to use an imperfect proxy, which is if you voted in a recent party primary, which party was it? And that's going to give us something, but as you'll see, the Democrats obviously didn't have a competitive primary in 2012. And so in those 3 states, we're just going to see far fewer people that were able to sort of credibly identify as a partisan. Okay. So then within each state, what do? We use the voter files to identify precincts whose boundaries were fixed or nearly fixed between 2012 and 2016. So much of American political and American political geography is studied at the county level. And you might think, well, counties are heterogeneous units. Like, why would I ever want to consider everybody who lives in Los Angeles County to be part of a single political unit? But the advantage, the one advantage to counties is their boundaries have been largely fixed for many, many decades, right? Whereas when we go to precincts, precinct boundaries are changing all the time. When I leave my house here in Philadelphia, I see signs on the street that tell me what the new precinct is and what the old one used to be. So what we need to do then is we need a way to identify which precincts had stable boundaries between 2012 and 2016. Thankfully, it turns out the vast majority do. But the way we do this is we go through the voter file and we identify all voters who appear in both voter files, the 2012, at the post-2012 and the post-2016, okay? And then we see what fraction of them for a given precinct have the same precinct in both years, right? What that's going to let us do is that's going to let us know, okay, here was a staple precinct with, the voters, only those who have fixed addresses. So what that's going to do is that's going to tell us, okay, in 2016, they clearly divided up this precinct, or in 2016, they clearly merged this precinct, okay, where they moved its boundaries. What we're then going to be able to do, and this is in part where the novelty of what we're able to offer comes through, we can classify each precinct based not just on the total number of different groups, based on like some precinct level number, but we can calculate in a precinct how many people fall into different bins defined by what party they're affiliated with, when they are present on the voter file. Are they present in 2012 and 2016, or just 2012 or just 2016? And then they're voting. Obviously, if you are only present in 2012, then we'll only care about you if you actually voted in 2012, right? But this allows us then to partition the full set of people who voted in these consistent precincts based on these three factors. And so that's powerful because now we can start to say, what in the precincts that say the GOP does much better in 2016, we can start to identify the attributes of those precincts. We also can then, since we can geocode at the level of the individual, we can identify for each precinct what individual weighted average of local census tracts we should use to try to put in a whole bunch of different kinds of demographic data, okay? And then we merge these various sources of data together. And what we wind up doing then is preserving the vast majority of the precincts in these states. We've gotten rid of precincts whose boundaries have changed significantly, or who, for whatever reason, there are tabulation errors. I actually, when I was doing this research, I found that in, I think it's Hamilton County, I believe, Herb, correct me if I'm wrong, is Cincinnati. And I found an error in the spreadsheet that they listed. And when I told my partner about this, she then said, does this mean Obama didn't win in 2012? It just turned out that they alphabetized one column, but not another. And so they did not list precincts with the corresponding vote totals. But it's just a suggestion of just like the amount of work that this takes. And we also then remove precincts that have real anomalies. So for instance, if the voter file data says that there should have been 1,000 people in that precinct, but there were 18 votes cast, we have a set of filters that are going to remove those anomalous precincts. So this is just a summary that gives you a sense of what we're left with. We do manage to preserve the vast majority of the data, but not entirely, right? You can see, for instance, that in Pennsylvania, we have 8,400 total precincts that we're able to analyze. In Ohio, it's about 7,000. Nevada, it's 1,600, and so on. So as we look down this table, here we report, and these are just for the precincts we're studying, right? Which is different, obviously, than the precincts. Then these numbers are going to be somewhat different than the actual outcomes. So key things to notice are that, say, for instance, in Florida, the mean precinct in our data went for the Democrats with 51.3% of the vote in 2012. That drops to 48.4, meaning that the Democratic share of the two-party vote declines by almost 3 percentage points. Interestingly, in Florida, the Republican share in these precincts declines by just about 2 percentage points. So it's less a story of the Republicans kind of taking the vote share that the Democrats had and more Democrats declining vote share. And then we also down here put in the turnout by party registration for some states or by primary participation. So Florida is one of those states in which people register with a party. And so of all voters, 43%, 43.1% in 2012 were registered as Democrats, 36.5% were registered as Republicans. This is commonly noted, though, that these gaps have been closing, especially in states like Pennsylvania in recent years. That is to say, it's commonly noted that even states that lean somewhat Republican can sometimes have more Democratic than Republican registrants. You can see that pretty powerfully here in Pennsylvania, where registered Democrats account for 55.4% in 2012, and then almost identical 1.2 percentage point difference, but pretty close in 2016. Pennsylvania is a state in which we have, especially outside of the southeastern corner, a lot of ancestral Democrats who haven't voted actually for Democrats in a long time. And one of the things we've seen in the Trump era is more of those people have started to actually register as Republicans so that they can participate in Republican primaries. And so even as polling data suggests that this state is moving away from Trump, registration numbers have been moving in the state towards the Republican Party. But broadly, what you can see from this is that in most cases, the turnout changes by party registration themselves were not especially pronounced. And if you look at, say, some of the differences where in Ohio, the Democrats go from getting 49.6% of the mean precinct here to just 41.6% of the mean precinct. That is a massive shift, right? For a large state between two elections only separated by 4 years. And that's already suggestive that there's very, very likely to be some important element of persuasion here, just in that the electorate, especially in a state like Ohio, isn't going to change that dramatically in that short period of time. Okay. Now, if we were to assume, and we shouldn't in other contexts, but I think it's a useful exercise to provide bounds, if we were to assume 100% party voting, so everybody we identify as a Democrat, in fact, votes for Hillary Clinton, or everybody we identify as a Republican, in fact, votes for Donald Trump, what we see is that partisan turnout should account for about 1 percentage point in Florida, where the total shift was 2.6. It should account for about 2.4 percentage points shifting away from the Republicans in Georgia, where the total shift was a 2.8 shift towards the Democrats. It should account for about 0.4 percentage points in Nevada, about 3 percentage points in Ohio. But keep in mind, Ohio, like Georgia, is one of these states without party registration. So I think it's a less useful exercise. Pennsylvania, you get about 1.1 percentage points when the total shift was more like 7.5. Okay, so already what those numbers are telling you is, at least under this assumption that people's registration accurately reflects their voting, partisan turnout differentials are really not what's going on here. Okay. So the next thing that we then want to do, and this is something that we're uniquely able to do given how we've constructed the data set, and that's why I spent, kind of maybe rather more time than you cared for on the actual data set construction. We can measure things like electoral stability. And so we're going to generate a measure of electoral stability at the precinct level. And what it's going to indicate is the fraction of the votes in that precinct that were cast by 2 election voters. Okay. And so if I have this, so one example would be, imagine a precinct that has 200 voters in 2012 and 100 voters in 2016. Okay. If none of the 2016 voters voted in 2012, totally new group of people, right? This is like a college dorm precinct, right? Stability would be 0, understandably. If 100 of the 2016 voters had voted in that precinct in 2012, then what we do is we take the 200, the 100, and what we'd see then is that 100 of the voters are, voted both elections. So stability in that case, we would term to be 0.5. Okay. So now we have a measure of stability, which is great. So now I'm going to get into some real empirical results. So here, what we see is again, we're going to do, you guys are stuck with the Keystone State because you are zooming into the Keystone State. So we are here in Pennsylvania. But it's also, Pennsylvania is a really important state. I think that certainly 538's model would tell you that Pennsylvania, though not definitely the tipping point state, is the single most likely state to be the tipping point state. And if you look at the Trump campaign's recent advertising expenditures, they're diming back on their ads in Wisconsin and Michigan, but keeping their ads here in Pennsylvania. And it seems like their strategy is, if anything, to sweep Pennsylvania, Arizona, North Carolina, and Florida. And that they see as their pathway. So here what we've done for Pennsylvania is we have grouped all of the precincts.
Dan, can you change the size a little bit so we can just see the figure, because we can't really read the font.
Sure. And yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So what I've done is I have created deciles where what we're seeing on the y-axis is the distribution of shifts towards the GOP for precincts in that decile. And the deciles are defined, so the further up you are, the more that particular precinct or group of precincts shifts towards the GOP. Then these horizontal lines tell you the mean for each decile, and the deciles are defined based on stability, right? So the first decile are those where the stability score ranges from 0.01, which is basically a college dorm, right? That's essentially none of the voters who were here in 2012 are still here in 2016. And then you can see very high levels of stability where places where a significant majority of the voters are the same voters in both elections. Okay. And so what we can see when doing this is, first off, that stability does not seem to be strongly related to the shift towards the GOP. If it were the case that the Pennsylvania shift to the GOP in 2016 had largely been driven by turnout, now that could either be because Democrats are staying home in 2016, or because Republicans are staying home in 2012 and then getting more engaged in 2016. If that had been the main story, we shouldn't expect to see quite this flat line, right? We should instead expect to see that as a precinct is, in fact, what we should expect to see is that the less stable precincts see more shift toward the GOP. If anything, we almost see the opposite, right? But the key point is that knowing a precinct's level of stability on average tells us basically nothing about how likely it is to shift. So this measure of stability that we went through all the work to put together is not actually giving us almost any predictive power on its own. Okay. And that's instructive because certainly some of the narratives would suggest that stability is going to be close. Like if these are just totally turnout driven elections, then we should have seen the highly unstable places shifting differently and shifting more towards the GOP. And we should have seen the highly stable places on the right side of this figure not shifting to the GOP as much. Okay. So that's one suggestive piece of evidence, right? Just a descriptive finding. We can show the same evidence for Florida or indeed for any of our other states. So here's Florida. Florida, you'll notice if you look on the right at the legend, Florida in general just has more people moving in, right? Maybe your parents or grandparents have moved into Florida. So we see lower levels of stability generally. But again, we basically see that stability tells us almost nothing about how likely a precinct is to shift towards or away from the GOP. Okay, that's probably a good place to just stop and see if there are questions.
We have actually a number of questions, but because we're at 12:50, I think we should probably go to the end and do them then.
Okay, great. So then that pattern actually holds across the states. But one of the key questions you might ask is instead, what about partisan registration? That is to say, just overall stability isn't telling me really whether the Democrats are turning out or staying home, the Republicans are turning out or staying home. And indeed, as this figure shows, the deciles that have the most compositional shift to the GOP also do tend to have the larger vote shifts to the GOP. That said, here in Pennsylvania, even places that had turnout shifts that should have been favorable to the Democrats, say like these two deciles here, nonetheless see shifts that are slightly pro-Trump on average, slightly pro-GOP on average, suggesting that, yes, turnout is some part of the story, but there's even in places where turnout advantages the Democrats, the baseline shift goes to the Republicans. So now, just by way of like being conscious of time and moving forward, I want to present a regression-based approach. So here what we're going to do is we're going to model a Y, which is the net change in Republican vote margin from 2012 to 2016. And we're going to do it using a vector of the 15 possible combinations of your party, your status on the voter file, that is to say, were you present in both elections or just one or the other, and your voting pattern in both elections. Okay. So we now have a vector of those 15 counts, what number of voters fall into each of those mutually exclusive and exhaustive categories. And we're also going to control for just the raw overall level of turnout to capture intercept shift. Sorry, not to capture intercept shifts, but to capture sort of baseline shifts that, like, as you have more voters, we may see a shift in one direction or another. And I will zoom in on this to try to make sense of it. This is a table showing a wide range of different kinds of models and results. But let me just walk through one case, which is Florida. Okay, so these top 5 rows tell us about Florida. Florida has 4,822 precincts. The average precinct shifted by just about 38 votes to the Republicans between 2012 and 2016. When we use that modeling approach that I just talked about, so we're accounting for turnout in all of the ways we've measured it, we can explain about 26 votes per precinct on average, right? And so if we roughly think of that as a measure of the compositional effect, the turnout effect, and it has an associated standard error of about 2.2, then in Florida, the composition effect as a sort of fraction of the total shift is 69 or 70%, meaning that with this model alone, we can explain almost 70% of the variation in Florida. So in Florida, composition does seem to matter a lot, and that's consistent with a variety of other pieces of research as well, that Florida tends to have pretty close elections, and where turnout can be a key source of those. But if we look at some of the blue wall states, places like Michigan, or especially Ohio and Pennsylvania here. So Ohio, we have 6,900 precincts. The sample mean shift, and again, I mentioned Ohio swung dramatically into the GOP column. The sample mean in Ohio was 69.5, so almost 70 votes moving to Trump in the average precinct. That's extraordinary. The compositional effect actually, it predicts the opposite direction. So if we just knew about these people, their voting patterns, we would have expected that we would have expected a shift in the opposite direction. So what that indicates is that the entire shift in Ohio towards the Republicans is explained by persuasion, is explained by 2 election voters who show up one time and vote for the Democrats and then show up another time and vote for the Republicans. Similarly, in Pennsylvania, though composition doesn't give us as much predictive power, again, it's in the opposite direction, meaning that if we just went based on our model alone and said, how much of this can we explain with compositional variables, it turns out that only heightens the mystery, because Trump's victory in Pennsylvania, his entire victory and then some, comes from persuasion. Okay, so that's the core take home, that in the states that Trump and the GOP in 2016 made up the most ground and saw the biggest shifts, those shifts were driven by persuasion. It's not that there is a single answer to this question. We see both persuasion and turnout very, very clearly at work. But the more the states swung in 2016, the more persuasion seems to be driving that swing. Okay. So great. With respect to conclusions, then, our central goal was to measure precinct level turnout patterns. And part of the emphasis of this project has been on improving available data. And we see certainly state level heterogeneity, but definite evidence for the continued role of persuasion across states, right? That Donald Trump is doing better across a wide range of different kinds of precincts. That partisan turnout does explain some of the transition, but more so in the racially and ethnically diverse states of Florida, Nevada, and Georgia. And that persuasion was critical as well, and especially critical in those states where we saw the largest swings. And that again makes sense given the math of persuasion, that if you're going to see a dramatic shift from one point in time to then an election just 4 years later, it's very likely that it's not going to be driven just by turnout. Now that all said, COVID and a lot of mobility, and here I would be more, I should listen to you guys rather than telling you about this. But I think there's always the possibility that there will be large scale shifts, right? With say Hurricane Katrina or other large scale migrations. There's certainly opportunities for influx of new voters. By and large, if you want to explain a large shift, persuasion is probably going to get you there. So yeah, those are my extra figures. So I think this is a great time to see what questions you may have.
Super. Thanks so much, Dan. That was terrific. And we especially appreciated you putting it in the context of what's happening today. Nathan, do you want to say your question?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. Yeah, I was just curious about between elections, whether or not voters change their party affiliation, especially if they're going to be changing the party that they're voting for. I'm just curious whether past literature has looked into that and how that is accounted for in putting together these two separate elections, and if someone shifts from one party to the other, how that fits into all this. Thanks.
That's a great question. And just to say operationally, what we did, and there's no perfect choice here, because if somebody is registered with one party or votes in one primary and then another party's primary in the next election, we have to classify them one way. And so what we wound up doing is we would classify you based on your most recent party affiliation. But that obviously means that we have in some ways, our measures of partisanship are more skewed to 2016 than to 2012. Now that said, if people are aware of the CNN political commentator Harry Enton, who's a kind of elections junkie, in his Twitter bio it says party registration does not equal party ID, right? And so that's that is the statement, that's the hill he wants to die on. And it's true in the sense that people not infrequently will maintain a party registration for sometimes years or even decades after they have stopped thinking of themselves in that party. People who are new registrants, and there's also the problem of covert partisans, right? And state laws matter. If I live in Pennsylvania and if I live in Philadelphia, which I do, if I am not registered in the Democratic Party, then in essence, I'm not participating in the mayoral election, right? Because the mayoral election is very, very likely to take place within the Democratic primary. But so different people, depending on where they live, may register differently, right? Michigan, for instance, you can, on the day of the election, decide, I want to vote in this primary or I want to vote in that primary. And so in Michigan, you see more strategic behavior. There are not a ton of voters who are saying today I need to be a Democrat or today I need to be a Republican, but there's some of that. There was a debate in 72 about whether George Wallace in part did as well as he did in Michigan not because of Republicans who voted for him in the primary there. But to get back to your question, The new registrants, if somebody just registered and they registered as a Democrat or Republican, they're very likely to think about themselves in those terms. Older registrants, however, there may be significant slippage. So we see West Virginia still, I believe to this day, Democrats have a registration advantage in West Virginia, even though they're going to lose West Virginia by like, large double digits, right? The problem is that many people just initially register, and then since only about a quarter of the electorate or so are reliable primary voters, there are lots of people who don't need to re-register, right? Because it would just never come up if they don't live in a state with close primaries or they don't vote in primaries. For that significant set of people, it usually takes just a long period of time. Some of them will go to the grave registered with a party that they haven't voted for in many, many years, right? And in fact, when we looked at this data, Pennsylvania, outside of the kind of urban and the metropolitan core, sorry, it's not the core, but it's the part that I happen to live in. Knowing that a Democrat didn't turn out in 2012 and then did turn out in 2016, usually you'd think, okay, Hillary Clinton should like that, right? Those people are Democrats. But the more of those people in a precinct in Pennsylvania, the better Trump did, because there were so many of these ancestral Democrats who in fact hadn't voted for Democrats in years.
Great, let me take another question. Sorry, Dan, because we have a couple of other questions. I know Nathan's question was so good that you want to talk about it more, but I want to take a question from Dennis about migration, the big sort, and then maybe tag it onto the question I had, which is following up on what we were saying before the seminar. You were saying demography matters in the long term, but not the short term.
Cool.
That's not
that was the question essentially is, sorry. So and I'm wondering if, maybe through the voter files or some other way, you can empirically assess whether this big sort hypothesis is contributing much to the polarization we're seeing.
That's a great question. And it's something I've given a fair amount of thought to. You kindly mentioned at the outset, this 2018 book that I wrote about, and the core argument of the 2018 book is that American politics is losing its local idiosyncrasies, right? It used to be that you needed to know specifically where you were because the Italian community would be Republican in some places and Democratic in other places, right? And that the same basic demographics would predict being a Republican in some places and Democrats in others. And the broad argument of the book is that the increasingly nationalizing forces of party polarization and our new news media have meant that the key thing to know is more like the basic facts about somebody in the sense of kind of racial and ethnic background, education levels, income, gender identity, that takes you pretty far. And our models just less and less do we need more idiosyncratic terms. Okay, so the big sort hypothesis is associated with Bill Bishop in a book written a little more than a decade ago, that people are increasingly moving to like-minded partisan communities. And one of the big challenges to this is kind of like, what's the baseline, right? It may well be that 2020, if contemporary polling data is at all, is anything reasonable, it would show that America is much less sorted, because we're going to see Democrats doing pretty well in, if not winning, they're not going to win, but they could do really well in South Carolina. They could do really well in Kansas. And my read on the evidence is that the evidence that people are selecting neighborhoods on the basis of their politics. We're a big country, as you guys know, 330 million people. Within that, you can identify subgroups with a lot of quirky behaviors. Are there small numbers of people who are actually selecting neighborhoods on their politics? Yes, but they're small. Are there larger numbers of people who are selecting neighborhoods for a wide range of reasons that happen to be correlated with their politics? Yes, it does seem like urban-rural divides have been growing. But even then, that often overstates. And you know, one of the things that we see, even here in Pennsylvania, if you go to the smaller cities, it's like Allentown, Erie, Wilkes-Barre, they still show the pattern that they're Democratic right in the core, and then it sort of the extent to which they're Democratic dissipates, and the further you get from the urban core, the more Republican it gets. And yes, that particularly as education levels become associated both with mobility and more associated with party identification, if that trend continues, I think that you know, we will see big sort style effects, not driven by people actually choosing neighborhoods on partisanship, but driven by the associated political effects. The question is then, and this gets back to Josh's point as well, those kinds of factors operate on a different time frame. And so you could also imagine that a significant shock to the political system in which one party goes in a pretty different direction could break these relationships in really important ways. And one of the things I'm very curious to see is whether the Democrats continue in a direction of catering more to a diverse, but often, you know, middle class or upper middle class kind of constituency. And if they're able to hold together what are in some sense groups that have some pretty opposed interests.
Great. Let's thank Dan. We're out of time. Wonderful. I'll just ask one concluding question. Let's say we're not interested in the political outcome of this election, but in the scientific outcome. What's something we can lay a side bet on that is of scientific interest of what's going to happen this year?
Oh, I mean, I think turnout, like what is turnout going to be, is a fascinating question. Irrespective of the baseline, you know, what is the tipping point state going to be? And I also think how large are the gaps between the president? Typically, we think of the president as sort of defining what that party's kind of natural vote is, but it is quite possible that President Trump may over or underperform other Republicans on the ticket. And so I think those gaps, that's another really interesting thing to look for. So yeah, I'm paying a lot of attention to turnout, a lot of attention to whether, you know, split ticket voting in the kinds of places, like do wealthy suburban areas in the Kansas suburbs that have traditionally voted for Republicans, but don't really like Donald Trump, are they then gonna, you know, get right back to the Republican Party for the Senate race or not? I think those kinds of questions I'm gonna be fascinated to see.
Super. Well, thanks so much. We really appreciated you traveling all the way across the country virtually, but also traveling across fields. It was great to have a political scientist as part of our demography brown bag. And thanks again so much.
Cool. Thank you, guys.